Hi, I'm Liam, a 27-year-old freelance graphic designer. I'm the kind of guy who enjoys a quiet, laid-back life. My work keeps me busy, but it also gives me the freedom to create my own schedule, which is something I love. I live alone in a small apartment, surrounded by sketches, half-finished designs, and an embarrassing number of empty coffee mugs. My sense of humor is what gets me through most days. Sarcasm and quick comebacks have always been my thing. My family is a huge part of my life. We're pretty close, and even though we have our ups and downs, I'd say we get along better than most. My parents are semi-retired and host most of our family events, which have always been a cornerstone of our connection. My siblings play a big role in that dynamic too. Olivia, my oldest sister, is 32 and married. She's like the family diplomat, always trying to keep the peace and smooth things over when tensions rise. Then there's Alex, who's 30 and recently engaged to Rachel. Alex and I used to get along pretty well, but things have felt different since Rachel came into the picture. Lastly, there's Mia, the youngest at 22. She's in college, and despite being the baby of the family, she's sharp, observant, and has a knack for seeing through people. With all of us being so different, our family gatherings are lively, chaotic, and usually a lot of fun. Or at least they used to be. Rachel, Alex's fiancée, is where things start to get complicated. She's 29, polished, and has a way of carrying herself that makes it clear she's used to getting what she wants. When she first started coming to family events 2 years ago, I didn't think much of it. I figured she'd eventually warm up to the group, but it didn't take long to realize that wasn't happening. Rachel always seemed a little distant, like she was tolerating being there rather than enjoying it. At first, I chalked it up to nerves or a difference in personalities, but over time, her icy attitude toward me became impossible to ignore. It wasn't outright hostility, more like subtle jabs, exaggerated sighs, or rolled eyes whenever I made a joke. It was like I couldn't do anything right in her presence. For a while, I let it slide. I'm not the kind of person who looks for conflict, and I figured it wasn't worth making a big deal out of. Besides, family gatherings were important to me. They were my way of staying connected, especially since I don't have a ton of friends outside of work. Sundays at my parents' house were a highlight of my week. Good food, lots of laughs, and just enough chaos to keep things interesting. But with Rachel around, the vibe started to change. I could feel her tension from across the room, and it started making me second-guess everything I said or did. Was I being too sarcastic? Too casual? Did my jokes really come off as rude? It was frustrating, but I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal. Then came Thanksgiving, the turning point for everything. Thanksgiving is one of those traditions that's sacred in our family. My dad always insists on carving the turkey himself, even though he's terrible at it. It's one of those quirks we've all come to love, watching him struggle while cracking jokes to lighten the mood. This year, though, Dad handed the carving duties to Alex, which turned into its own kind of disaster. As Alex fumbled with the knife, I made a lighthearted comment about how he should probably stick to spreadsheets. It was the kind of thing we always did, teasing each other without malice. But before Alex could respond, Rachel cut in with a sharp, "Do you ever stop trying to make people feel stupid?" The room went dead silent. Everyone froze, unsure of how to react. Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly caught off guard, but he didn't say anything. I was stunned. I'd been joking, just like I always did, and suddenly it felt like I'd committed some kind of crime. I tried to laugh it off, saying it wasn't that serious, but Rachel wasn't having it. She just shook her head and muttered something under her breath. For the rest of the evening, the atmosphere was tense. I could feel the weight of Rachel's disapproval hanging over everything, and for the first time, I couldn't wait to leave a family gathering. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Rachel's comment wasn't just a passing remark. It felt deliberate, like she'd been holding back those feelings for a while. It made me wonder if this was just the beginning of a bigger problem. As I replayed the evening in my head, I realized that no one had come to my defense. Not Alex, not my parents, not even Olivia. Everyone had just sat there, letting Rachel's words hang in the air. It was like they were afraid to upset her. That realization stung more than I expected. Looking back, I should have said something then, but I didn't. I told myself it wasn't worth making a scene over, but deep down, I knew this wasn't the last time Rachel and I would clash. Something about her made it impossible for me to be myself, and I had a feeling things were only going to get worse from here. For as long as I can remember, Sundays have been sacred in my family. Every week, we gather at my parents' house for dinner. It's nothing fancy, just a chance to catch up, share a meal, and enjoy each other's company. Sometimes we play board games after dinner or watch a movie if everyone feels like it. These moments are the glue that keeps us close, especially now that we're all adults with our own lives. For me, these dinners are more than just a meal. They're my main connection to the family. I don't have a big social circle, so I look forward to this time. But lately, that sense of comfort has started to slip away, and I know exactly why. Rachel. When Alex first brought Rachel to one of these dinners, I didn't think much of it. She seemed polite, though a little reserved. I figured she was just adjusting to the chaos that comes with being part of a big family. But as the weeks went on, I started noticing little things. She'd roll her eyes at my jokes or give me this tight-lipped smile, like she was barely tolerating me. I shrugged it off, thinking it wasn't a big deal. Maybe she just didn't get my sense of humor. At first, I tried to be understanding. Not everyone clicks right away, and I figured Rachel and I would warm up to each other eventually. But instead of things getting better, they got worse. She started making snide comments, usually in response to something I said. If I cracked a joke, she'd say something like, "Wow, Liam, so original," dripping with sarcasm. Or she'd accuse me of being rude when all I was doing was teasing, the way I always have with my siblings. I couldn't figure out why she seemed to have a problem with me. I wasn't doing anything differently, and no one else in the family seemed bothered by my jokes. The strange part was how subtle it all was. She never outright insulted me or caused a scene. It was always these quiet digs, things that were easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But I noticed. And once I started noticing, I couldn't stop. It felt like I was walking on eggshells every time Rachel was around, unsure of what would set her off next. Still, I told myself not to make it a big deal. Family dinners were too important to me to let one person ruin them. Things came to a head at Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving has always been a big deal in my family. My dad insists on doing the turkey carving himself every year, even though he's hilariously bad at it. It's become a bit of a tradition to watch him struggle with the knife while we all crack jokes. But this year, Dad decided to pass the carving duties to Alex. It didn't go well. Alex is great at a lot of things, but carving a turkey isn't one of them. As he fumbled with the knife, I couldn't resist making a lighthearted comment. Looks like you should stick to spreadsheets, Alex. It was the kind of teasing we've always done, harmless and good-natured. But before Alex could even respond, Rachel snapped. Do you ever stop trying to make people feel stupid? She said, her voice sharp and loud enough to silence the whole room. My first reaction was shock. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at her. Alex looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything, which only made the moment feel worse. I tried to laugh it off, saying, it's just a joke, but Rachel wasn't having it. Rachel muttered something under her breath that I couldn't catch, but her tone said it all. The rest of the meal was tense, and I could feel everyone trying to pretend nothing had happened. I kept my head down and stayed quiet, but inside I was fuming. It wasn't just that Rachel had snapped at me, it was how she made me feel like I was the problem, like I was somehow ruining Thanksgiving. What hurt the most, though, was the silence from my family. No one came to my defense. Not Alex, not my parents, not even Olivia, who usually steps in when things get awkward. It felt like I was being left out in the cold. When dinner was over, I didn't stick around as long as I usually do. I said my goodbyes, gave polite hugs, and headed home. On the drive back, I replayed the scene over and over in my head. I couldn't figure out what I'd done to deserve that reaction. Was it really that bad to tease Alex about the turkey? Or was there something bigger going on that I wasn't seeing? The whole thing left a sour taste in my mouth, and for the first time, I didn't feel excited about the next family gathering. Looking back, I wish I'd spoken up that night. I wish I'd asked Rachel what her problem was, or at least told my family how I felt. But at the time, I didn't want to make things worse. I told myself it was just one awkward moment and that everything would blow over. But deep down, I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. Rachel wasn't going anywhere, she was engaged to Alex, after all. And if she already had this much influence over the family dynamic, I could only imagine what the future would hold. Thanksgiving had always been one of my favorite holidays, a time to laugh, eat too much, and feel grateful for the people in my life. But this year, it felt different. It felt like something had been taken away, and I wasn't sure how to get it back. For the first time, I started to wonder if the family gatherings I cherished so much were about to change forever. And if that was the case, where did that leave me? After Thanksgiving, things slowly began to change, and not for the better. Rachel started taking a much bigger role in our family gatherings. It wasn't obvious at first. She'd casually suggest a change here and there, nothing that seemed like a big deal on its own. But over time, her suggestions started to pile up. For instance, she proposed making Christmas dinner more formal, with assigned seating and a full sit-down meal. Normally, we'd just do a casual buffet, where everyone grabbed what they wanted and sat wherever they liked. That relaxed vibe was part of what made the holidays fun, but Rachel insisted it was too chaotic and that a formal dinner would feel more special. I didn't say much about it at the time, but I could tell my parents were hesitant too. Still, they went along with her ideas, probably because they didn't want to upset her. Alex backed her up, of course, and it felt like everyone else was tiptoeing around her to keep the peace. I wasn't used to our family traditions being up for debate, and it left me feeling like I didn't recognize these gatherings anymore. They were starting to feel more like events than family time. The changes didn't stop there. Rachel started making small complaints about me behind the scenes, things I didn't even know about until much later. Apparently, she told Alex, and eventually my parents, that my jokes were passive-aggressive and made her feel unwelcome. She painted me as someone who didn't respect her or take her seriously, which couldn't have been further from the truth. I mean, sure, I made jokes. It's just my way of breaking the ice or keeping things light, but I'd never meant them in a mean-spirited way. What hurt the most was that my parents seemed to take her side without even talking to me about it. One Sunday dinner, my mom casually suggested that I tone it down and be a little more considerate around Rachel. She said it like she was giving me helpful advice, but it felt like a slap in the face. What was I doing that was so wrong? And why was no one telling me this directly? It felt like everyone was walking on eggshells around Rachel, and I was the only one being singled out. As these changes kept happening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pushed out of my own family. It wasn't just the traditions that were changing, it was the entire dynamic. Rachel had this way of steering conversations and plans in her direction, and no one seemed willing to push back. I noticed little things like how she'd redirect the topic if someone brought up a memory that didn't include her, or how she'd make subtle digs at my parents' casual hosting style. What bothered me most, though, was how much control she seemed to have over Alex. Alex used to be someone I could talk to about anything, but now it felt like he was completely on her side, no questions asked. If I tried to bring up how uncomfortable things were getting, he'd brush it off, saying I was overreacting or that I needed to give Rachel a break. It was like he couldn't or wouldn't see what was happening. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more isolated I felt. I'd always thought of my family as a safe space, but now it felt like I didn't belong. What really confused me was the lack of direct communication. If Rachel had a problem with me, why didn't she just say it to my face? Instead, she went to Alex and my parents, framing me as the villain while keeping up her polite act in person. It was like she wanted to control the narrative without giving me a chance to explain myself. And the worst part, it was working. My parents started looking at me differently, as if I were the one causing tension in the family. I tried talking to Olivia about it, hoping she'd have some insight. She listened, but her advice was frustratingly neutral. "You know how Alex is when he's in a relationship," she said. "He just wants to keep Rachel happy." It felt like no one was willing to stand up to her, even when it was clear she was overstepping. I couldn't understand why keeping Rachel happy was suddenly more important than keeping the family together. It left me feeling blindsided and completely out of the loop. As the weeks went on, I found myself dreading family gatherings instead of looking forward to them. I started overthinking everything. What I said, how I said it, even how I interacted with Alex and Rachel. It felt like I was under a microscope, constantly being judged for things I didn't even realize I was doing. My usual humor and easygoing attitude started to fade, replaced by a constant sense of unease. I couldn't help but wonder if my family even noticed how much I was struggling. They were so focused on keeping Rachel happy that they seemed blind to how much her presence was affecting me. It wasn't just about the jokes or the traditions, it was about feeling like I no longer had a voice in my own family. For the first time, I felt like an outsider looking in, and I didn't know how to fix it. All I knew was that something had to give, because I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Not anymore. It all came to a head during one of our family game nights. These nights used to be a highlight for me, full of laughter, friendly competition, and the kind of chaos that only a big family can create. We were playing a trivia game, and Rachel was, as usual, taking charge of the rules. She had this habit of tweaking them mid-game to suit her team, which I found both annoying and amusing. I couldn't help myself. I made a sarcastic comment, something along the lines of, "Wow, Rachel, are you writing the rulebook as we go?" It wasn't anything I hadn't said before, and in any other setting it would have been shrugged off or even laughed at. But not this time. Rachel's face turned red, and she slammed her cards down on the table. "I'm so tired of this," she said, her voice shaking. "You're always making these comments like I'm some kind of joke. I've had enough of your targeted attacks." The room fell silent, everyone frozen as Rachel stormed out. Alex followed her, muttering something about giving her space. I sat there, stunned, as my family awkwardly avoided eye contact. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. What just happened? The next day, Alex called me. I figured he wanted to smooth things over, or at least talk about what happened. But as soon as I picked up the phone, I knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "Liam," he said, his tone serious, "Rachel is really upset. She doesn't feel comfortable coming to family gatherings if you're going to keep making her feel unwelcome." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. Rachel didn't feel comfortable? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to defend myself, explaining that I wasn't trying to attack her, I was just joking, the same way I always had. But Alex wasn't having it. "You need to take responsibility for how you're making her feel," he said. "This isn't just about you. Rachel deserves to feel respected." The more he talked, the more it felt like he was laying the entire situation at my feet. By the end of the call, he dropped the bombshell. Rachel wouldn't come to another family gathering if I was there. I didn't even know how to respond. I felt angry, confused, and above all, betrayed. I thought that was the worst of it, but then my parents called me later that day. I figured they'd want to check in, maybe hear my side of the story. Instead, they suggested something that left me speechless. "Liam," my mom said gently, "maybe it's best if you sit out the next family dinner. Just for now. We want to give Rachel some time to feel comfortable again." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own parents, the people who had always preached about the importance of family, were asking me to step aside to smooth things over. I tried to explain how hurt I felt, how it seemed like everyone was taking Rachel's side without even trying to understand mine. But my mom just sighed. "We're not taking sides," she said. "We're just trying to keep the peace." My dad chimed in, saying something about how it's important to compromise for the sake of the family. But to me, it felt like I was the only one being asked to compromise. They weren't just asking me to skip dinner, they were asking me to step back from my own family. It was like I didn't matter as much as keeping Rachel happy. After that call, I spent hours replaying everything in my head. Was I really the problem? I thought back to all the little moments that had led up to this, the jokes, the awkward silences, the tension that seemed to follow Rachel and me like a cloud. I couldn't see how my actions were so terrible that they warranted this kind of reaction. All I'd done was be myself, the same way I'd always been. But now it felt like my family was telling me that who I was wasn't good enough. The hardest part was the silence from everyone else. Olivia, who usually stepped in to mediate, hadn't said a word. Mia, who was usually quick to call out unfairness, was nowhere to be found. It felt like I was completely alone in this, and I didn't know how to fix it. The family gatherings that had once been my safe space were now a source of anxiety and pain. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to go back, but the idea of being excluded hurt more than I cared to admit. As the days went on, I started to notice how much this situation was affecting me. I felt like I was constantly walking around with a weight on my chest, unsure of where I stood with my own family. I couldn't stop thinking about how things had gotten to this point. Rachel had been part of the family for less than 2 years, and yet it felt like she had more influence than I did. How was that fair? But more than that, I started questioning my place in the family. If my parents were willing to ask me to step aside for the sake of someone who wasn't even officially part of the family yet, what did that say about how they valued me? It felt like I was being punished for something I didn't even fully understand, and no one seemed willing to help me figure it out. All I knew was that something had to change, because I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. Not anymore. Despite my parents' suggestion to sit out the next family dinner, I decided to go anyway. It wasn't an easy choice. I knew the atmosphere would be tense, and I wasn't sure how things would play out. But I couldn't stand the thought of staying away from my own family because of Rachel's complaints. I figured if there was ever a time to address this mess, it was now. I needed to know exactly what I'd done to make her so upset, and I wasn't going to get any answers by staying silent. When I arrived, everything seemed normal on the surface. My mom was in the kitchen finishing up dinner, my dad was in the living room talking to Alex, and Rachel was sitting at the dining table scrolling through her phone. I greeted everyone as usual, though I could feel the awkward tension in the air. Rachel barely looked up when I said hi, which only confirmed what I already knew. This was going to be a long night. Still, I told myself to stay calm. I wasn't there to start a fight, I just wanted answers. Dinner started off uneventfully, though the conversation felt forced. My mom kept asking generic questions, like how work was going or if Mia had any new classes coming up. I could tell she was trying to fill the silence, but it wasn't working. Every now and then I'd catch Rachel glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, her expression unreadable. Finally, I decided to break the ice. So, Rachel, I said, keeping my tone as casual as I could, I've been meaning to ask, what exactly have I done that makes you feel so uncomfortable? I think it's only fair that we talk about it openly. The room went dead silent. Everyone froze, their forks hovering midair. Rachel looked startled for a moment, but then her expression hardened. Are you serious? She said, her voice trembling. You've been making passive-aggressive comments toward me since the day we met. You act like I don't belong here, like I'm some kind of outsider, and now you're putting me on the spot in front of everyone? How is that fair? Her voice was rising, and I could feel the tension in the room growing heavier by the second. I tried to stay calm, even though her words stung. I'm not trying to attack you, I said. I just want to understand. If I've done something to make you feel unwelcome, I want to fix it. But I can't do that if I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I thought my response was reasonable, but Rachel didn't seem to see it that way. Her eyes filled with tears, and she suddenly burst out, this is exactly what I mean. You're bullying me into justifying my feelings, and it's not fair. Before I could respond, Alex jumped in. Liam, enough. He snapped. You're gaslighting her right now. You're making her feel like her feelings aren't valid, and it's not okay. You've been doing this for months, and it's ruining her relationship with the family. His words hit me like a slap. Gaslighting? Bullying? Those weren't just accusations, they were character attacks. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For a moment, I just sat there, stunned. I looked around the table, hoping someone would step in, but no one said a word. My parents avoided eye contact, staring down at their plates like they were hoping the moment would pass. Even Mia, who was usually quick to call out unfairness, stayed silent. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, and I was completely alone. Finally, I stood up. I'm not trying to gaslight anyone, I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and hurt, but I'm not going to sit here and be accused of things I haven't done. If no one here is willing to have an honest conversation, then I don't see the point of being here. With that, I grabbed my coat and walked out. As I drove home, a million thoughts raced through my head. I kept replaying the dinner, wondering if there was something I could have said or done differently. Maybe I should have waited to bring it up in private, or maybe I should have just let it go altogether. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that no matter what I did, Rachel would have found a way to twist it. What hurt the most wasn't Rachel's reaction. It was my family's silence. I'd always thought we were close, that we had each other's backs no matter what. But in that moment, it felt like they'd all chosen her over me. I couldn't understand why no one had stood up for me, or at least tried to mediate the situation. It was like they were too afraid of upsetting Rachel to see how much I was hurting. By the time I got home, I felt completely drained. I wasn't just angry, I was heartbroken. For the first time, I truly questioned my place in the family. Was I really the problem? Or was I just the easiest target? One thing was clear, things couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. After that disastrous family dinner, I made a decision. I couldn't keep putting myself in situations where I felt disrespected and unsupported. For the first time in my life, I stopped going to family gatherings entirely. It wasn't an easy choice. Those dinners and game nights had always been my anchor, the one place I could count on to feel at home. But lately, they'd become a source of stress and hurt, and I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. At first, I thought someone might reach out to me, maybe to check in or even try to patch things up. But days turned into weeks, and the silence from my family was deafening. No texts, no calls, just nothing. The only person who broke the silence was Mia, my youngest sister. She sent me a text one evening, asking how I was doing. When I told her how left out I felt, she admitted that she thought Rachel was being manipulative. I don't agree with how she's treating you, she said, but I don't want to cause drama. Her words were a small comfort, but they didn't change the fact that I felt completely alone. What made things worse was Rachel's activity on social media. Every week, she'd post photos from family gatherings, carefully curated to show how perfect everything was. There she was, smiling with Alex, sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by my family. The captions were even worse, things like finally setting boundaries or protecting my peace. It was like she was sending me a message, reminding me that she was still there while I was on the outside looking in. At first, I tried to ignore it. Social media wasn't real life, I told myself. But it was hard not to feel the sting when I saw picture after picture of my family laughing and having fun without me. It was like I didn't even exist. Every post felt like another reminder that I wasn't welcome anymore, and it hurt more than I wanted to admit. I'd always thought of my family as a solid foundation, something I could rely on no matter what. But now it felt like that foundation was crumbling, and I wasn't sure how to put the pieces back together. In the quiet moments, I found myself replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. Was I really the problem? Had my jokes been too harsh? I thought about all the times Rachel had rolled her eyes or accused me of being rude, and I started to wonder if there was some truth to her complaints. Maybe I hadn't been as considerate as I thought. Maybe I had been too sarcastic or dismissive. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like Rachel's reactions didn't match my actions. Sure, I'd made jokes, but they were never meant to hurt anyone. My family had always teased each other. It was part of how we connected. So why was it suddenly a problem now? And why was I the only one being held accountable? It didn't make sense. Still, the doubt lingered, gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, this was all my fault. Mia was the only person who seemed to understand how I was feeling. She'd text me occasionally, asking how I was holding up or sharing little updates about her life. One day, she opened up about how frustrated she was with the whole situation. "I see what Rachel's doing," she said. "She's making it all about her, and everyone else is just going along with it. But if I say anything, it's only going to cause more drama, and I don't want to make things worse." Her honesty was a relief, but it also left me feeling even more trapped. If even Mia, the most outspoken member of the family, didn't feel like she could stand up to Rachel, what chance did I have? It felt like Rachel had taken over my family, and everyone was too afraid to challenge her. I didn't know how to fix it, and the longer it went on, the more I started to question whether it was even worth trying. As the weeks turned into months, I tried to focus on other parts of my life. I threw myself into work, taking on more freelance projects than I normally would. I spent more time with a couple of close friends, people who didn't make me feel like I had to walk on eggshells. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the ache of being excluded from my own family never really went away. I thought about reaching out to my parents or even Alex, but every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated. What would I even say? It felt like the ball was in their court, not mine. They were the ones who had chosen to prioritize Rachel's comfort over mine. If they wanted to fix things, shouldn't they be the ones to make the first move? The longer I waited, the more it felt like they'd already made their choice, and it wasn't me. In the end, I realized I couldn't keep waiting for my family to come to me. If they weren't willing to stand up for me, I had to stand up for myself. I didn't know what that looked like yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly questioning my worth and replaying every interaction in my head. I deserved better than that. So, I decided to take things one day at a time. I focused on the people who did value me, like Mia and my close friends. I reminded myself that Rachel's opinion of me didn't define who I was. And while I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with my family, I knew I wasn't ready to give up completely. I just needed to find a way to move forward, on my terms. I had resigned myself to the idea that my family had chosen Rachel over me. I was still hurt, but I was learning to live with the distance. That's when Mia called me one evening, her voice urgent and full of frustration. "You're not going to believe what just happened," she said. She went on to tell me about a minor disagreement Rachel had with Olivia during a family dinner. Apparently, Olivia had mentioned a slight change in their usual holiday plans, and Rachel snapped at her. She acted like it was a personal attack, Mia said. Olivia was trying to keep it calm, but Rachel just kept pushing until the whole room got quiet. Hearing this was like a weight being lifted. For the first time, someone else in the family was seeing Rachel's true colors. Mia admitted that it wasn't just that one incident. She'd been noticing Rachel's manipulative tendencies for a while. "I think you were right," she said. "Rachel's been making herself the victim and turning everyone against you." It felt like validation, but it also made me realize how far things had gone. If Rachel could turn the family against Olivia, who had always been the peacemaker, then no one was safe. A few days later, Mia told me she'd talked to Olivia about everything. Olivia was hesitant at first, but Mia managed to convince her to see the bigger picture. "I told her how Rachel's behavior has been affecting you and how unfair it's been," Mia explained. "I think she finally gets it." It was a relief to know that Olivia, of all people, was starting to understand. She'd always been the voice of reason in the family, and if she was willing to speak up, maybe things could change. Together, Mia and Olivia decided to confront my parents. They laid everything out: how Rachel's behavior was creating tension, how the family had been enabling her, and how unfairly I'd been treated. According to Mia, my mom was shocked to hear how bad things had gotten. My dad, who'd always tried to avoid conflict, didn't say much, but he didn't defend Rachel either. It seemed like the cracks were finally starting to show, and for the first time, the family was being forced to face the reality of the situation. The real surprise came when Alex called me a few days later. His voice sounded stiff, like he didn't want to be making the call but felt he had to. "Hey Liam," he said awkwardly. "We're having a family meeting this weekend, and, well, we want you to come." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For months I'd been excluded and ignored, and now, suddenly they wanted me back. I asked him what the meeting was about, but his answer was vague. "It's just a chance for everyone to talk things out," he said. "Mia and Olivia think it's important." His tone made it clear that he wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I could tell this wasn't just his decision. The rest of the family must have pushed for it. After a moment of hesitation, I agreed. "I'll come," I said, though I couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. I had no idea what to expect, and I wasn't sure if this was going to make things better or worse. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, imagining all the ways the conversation could go wrong. Would Rachel try to turn the family against me again? Would Alex take her side no matter what? And what if nothing changed? The thought of walking into that room and reliving all the hurt was almost too much to bear. But deep down, I knew I had to do it. This was my chance to finally speak my truth, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. When the day came, I walked into my parents' house feeling a mix of dread and determination. Everyone was already there, my parents, Alex, Rachel, Mia, and Olivia. The atmosphere was tense, but there was also a sense of purpose in the air. It was clear that this wasn't going to be just another awkward family dinner. This was a moment of reckoning, and everyone knew it. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever was about to come. As we all sat down in the living room, Olivia started things off. "We need to talk about what's been going on," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This family has always been about supporting each other, but lately it feels like we've lost sight of that." She turned to Rachel, her tone softening. "Rachel, I know you felt uncomfortable at times, and that's valid, but I also think we need to be honest about how this has affected Liam." Rachel's face hardened, but she didn't say anything. Olivia continued, laying out everything Mia had told her about Rachel's behavior. For the first time, it felt like someone was truly standing up for me, and it was both comforting and overwhelming. When Olivia finished, Mia chimed in, backing up everything she'd said. "This isn't about choosing sides," Mia said. "It's about being fair, and I think we've been unfair to Liam." Finally, it was my turn to speak. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I felt excluded from this family for months," I said. "I've been accused of things I didn't do, and no one gave me a chance to defend myself. I've made mistakes, sure, but I've always tried to be a good brother and son. It hurts to feel like I've been pushed aside."
Rachel finally spoke up, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to push you out, Liam," she said. "But you've made me feel like I don't belong." Her words were laced with emotion, but for the first time I saw them for what they were, an attempt to deflect responsibility. Before I could respond, Olivia cut in. "Rachel, this isn't just about you, it's about all of us, and we need to work on this together." As the conversation went on, it became clear that the family was finally starting to see the bigger picture. My parents apologized for not stepping in sooner, and even Alex admitted that he'd been too quick to take Rachel's side. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like there was hope for us to move forward. The family meeting started off tense, but I knew this was my chance to finally say what I had been holding back for months. Everyone was seated in the living room, my parents, Alex, Rachel, Mia, and Olivia. The air was heavy with anticipation. I didn't waste any time. I took a deep breath and said, "I need to talk about how I've been feeling. For months, I've been treated like I'm the problem in this family. I've been excluded, judged, and blamed for things I don't believe I've done. It's hurt me more than I can explain." I kept my voice calm, but I made sure they could hear the emotion behind my words. I've always been the one to crack jokes and keep things light, but I never meant to make anyone feel unwelcome. If I did, I wish someone had just told me instead of letting it build up to this. I paused, looking directly at Rachel. "I don't expect everyone to agree with me, but I need to set one thing straight. I'm not going to tolerate being disrespected or silenced in this family. If we're going to move forward, it has to be with honesty and mutual respect." Rachel didn't take long to respond. She shook her head, her voice trembling as she said, "This is exactly what I've been talking about. You're putting me on the spot, making me feel like the bad guy. I've never tried to push you out, Liam, but you've made me feel like I don't belong here." Every comment, every joke, it feels like a personal attack. Her eyes glistened with tears, and I could tell she was trying to sway the room with emotion. Before I could reply, Olivia spoke up. Her tone was steady, but there was no mistaking the firmness in her words. "Rachel, I think it's time we stop tiptoeing around the issue. Liam's jokes aren't the problem here. The way you've been handling things is, you've been quick to paint him as the villain, but no one else feels the way you do. You need to stop twisting everything to make it about you." Mia jumped in, backing her up. "We've all seen how you've been treating Liam, Rachel. You've been manipulating the situation, and it's not fair. It's not just about Liam, it's about the way you've been disrupting the entire family dynamic." Rachel's face flushed red, and for the first time, I saw her struggle to maintain her composure. Rachel tried to defend herself, but this time her words didn't land. "I'm just trying to protect myself," she said. "I shouldn't have to explain why I feel uncomfortable." But Mia wasn't having it. "No one's asking you to justify your feelings," she said firmly. "We're asking you to take responsibility for your actions. There's a difference." At that point, Alex finally spoke up, his voice low and hesitant. "Rachel, maybe they're right. Maybe we've handled this wrong." His words hung in the air, and Rachel turned to him, her expression a mix of shock and betrayal. "What are you saying?" she asked. "That I'm the problem?" Alex hesitated, then sighed. "I'm saying we all need to take a step back and think about how we've been treating each other. This can't just be about one person's feelings anymore." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was enough to shift the mood in the room. Rachel looked like she was holding back more tears, and after a long, uncomfortable silence, she stood up. "I think I need some air," she said quietly, and she walked out of the room. Alex followed her, leaving the rest of us sitting in the awkward silence they'd left behind. After they left, my parents turned to me, their faces full of regret. "Liam," my mom said softly, "we're sorry for how we handled this. We didn't realize how much you were hurting." My dad nodded in agreement. We should have stepped in sooner. You're part of this family, and we should have done a better job of making sure you felt that. Hearing their apologies felt like a weight being lifted off my chest. Thank you, I said. I don't need everything to be perfect, but I just want to feel like I belong here. That's all I've ever wanted. Olivia and Mia chimed in, reaffirming their support. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time in months, I felt like my voice was being heard. As the weeks went by, things started to shift. The family decided to set some new boundaries for future gatherings. No more ultimatums, no more silent treatment, and no more sweeping conflicts under the rug. If someone had an issue, they were expected to address it openly and respectfully. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Rachel, however, didn't take the changes well. She stopped attending family events altogether, and Alex followed her lead most of the time. It was sad to see the divide, but I realized it wasn't something I could control. I couldn't force Rachel to take accountability, and I couldn't make Alex see things from my perspective. All I could do was focus on rebuilding my relationships with the rest of the family. Over time, I reconnected with my parents, Olivia and Mia. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension and lingering hurt, but we were making progress. I kept my distance from Alex and Rachel, though. I knew I couldn't trust them the way I used to, and I had to accept that not all relationships can be salvaged. Looking back, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I'd finally stood up for myself and found my voice, but sadness that it had come at such a cost. My family wasn't perfect, but they were still my family. And while things would never go back to the way they were, I was determined to focus on the people who genuinely valued me. In the end, I learned that sometimes standing up for yourself means losing people you thought would always be there. But it also means finding strength in yourself and the relationships that truly matter. And for me, that was enough.
I'm a 24-year-old guy, and I think it's fair to say my family's not like most. Growing up, my parents had a clear favorite, and it wasn't me. My sister Jessica, who's 20 now, has been the center of their attention for as long as I can remember. For them, she could do no wrong. Even when she was doing well, plenty wrong. I'd love to say it didn't bother me, but honestly, being second in line for everything gets old fast. As a kid, I started noticing the difference in how they treated us pretty early. I'd ask for something small, money for a school trip, or maybe a pair of cleats for soccer, and I'd get the "we can't afford it" speech. Meanwhile, Jessica would get a new laptop or the latest phone because she needed it for school. I started piecing it together. My needs weren't as important. I didn't deserve the same support. I wasn't their golden child. That was always Jessica's role, and no one questioned it. Not her, not my parents, not even me for a while. Then there's Jessica herself. She's always been a handful. In high school, she was already making questionable decisions, but somehow her problems were always just that, a phase, a cry for help, something our parents needed to understand. They kept backing her up even when she went down roads that most parents would lose sleep over. When she got into drugs, dropped out of college, and went through a few bad relationships, my parents' answer was always the same: support her more, give her what she needs, and hope she'll figure it out. The thought of giving her any sort of tough love? Unthinkable. Meanwhile, I was left to figure things out on my own. I wasn't lucky enough to have my parents handing out support. I wanted to go to college, so I worked my butt off, pulling in scholarships and working part-time jobs to make ends meet. 2 jobs, actually, just to keep afloat. I learned early on that I could only depend on myself. Even the small amount I saved meant a lot to me because I knew I'd earned every single dollar. My parents would say things like, "You're so capable, you don't need our help." They framed it like a compliment, like I was somehow lucky for being ignored. After years of this, I had managed to save up $15,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. I kept it in a joint account with my mom, mostly out of habit from when I was younger. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. What's the harm in having a joint account with family, right? I never imagined that money would go anywhere except where I needed it to. But one day, everything changed. I logged into my account, probably out of a bit of paranoia I'd developed from always having to fend for myself, and my heart nearly stopped. Almost all the money I'd saved was gone. I stared at the screen, refreshing it a few times, hoping it was just some weird bank error. But no, my account had been cleared out. My first thought was that maybe it was a mistake, some kind of fraud. I went to my mom, confused, desperate for an explanation. She just shrugged and told me they'd used it to help Jessica get a fresh start. They had taken my savings to bail her out of whatever latest mess she'd gotten into, as if that was the obvious thing to do. That was my breaking point. I had scraped and saved every dollar, giving up normal college experiences and pulling ridiculous hours just to put away a bit of money, and they took it without even asking. No apology, no regret. In their eyes, Jessica needed it more, so that was that. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to argue, pointing out that this was my money, that I'd earned it. They dismissed me, saying I was selfish. That family is supposed to help each other. Apparently, helping each other only went one way in this family. Feeling lost and helpless, I reached out to my closest friends. I hadn't told many people about my family situation before, but at that moment, I needed someone to lean on. My friends listened, and they didn't hold back. They told me I deserved better, that I shouldn't have to keep going through this. They were blunt, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. One of them even offered to let me crash at his place if I ever wanted to leave. At that point, leaving sounded more tempting than ever. I couldn't see a future for myself in a home where I was only valuable as an ATM for my sister's mistakes. I knew I needed to plan my escape. The thought was terrifying, leaving everything I'd known, even if it wasn't much. I'd have to start from scratch, probably with less than I'd had when I started saving up in the first place. But I was done with the excuses, the favoritism, the constant feeling of being used. It was time to take control of my life, even if it meant walking away from the people who were supposed to be my family. Packing up my room felt surreal. I'd grown up there with posters on the walls, notes from school, memories of better times that felt like a lifetime ago. But each item I packed was another step away from the life I didn't want anymore. The reality hit hard, but it also felt strangely liberating. I was finally making a choice for myself. And then, with a duffel bag and a few essentials, I was ready. I knew this was the end of something, and whatever came next, it was on me now. The life I was leaving behind was a closed chapter, and there was no going back. Update 1. After leaving my parents' house, my friend Chris was there for me. He offered his couch for a few days, which was a relief. I'd packed up my essentials, but sleeping on someone's couch wasn't a long-term plan. I didn't want to outstay my welcome, and besides, I wanted a place to call my own. The first thing I did was hit the job boards, looking for anything that could give me some extra cash, or even better, a bit of stability. My current part-time jobs helped, but with the money I had left, getting an apartment felt like an uphill battle. I realized quickly that affordable housing was almost non-existent in my area. Every place I looked at was way out of my budget. The few that seemed manageable looked like they'd been neglected for years. My savings had been wiped, so I had no choice but to consider finding a third job. Every dollar mattered if I wanted a shot at paying rent. One afternoon, I got a call for a job interview for a retail position that paid a bit more than my current ones. It wasn't a massive leap, but it was something. The interviewer asked if I could handle long hours and weekends, which I was more than willing to take on. I had no choice but to make this work, so I accepted any shift they could offer me. I left the interview feeling hopeful. It was a small win, but every bit helped. On my way back, I ran into Zach, an old friend from high school. We hadn't spoken in years, but he'd heard a bit about my situation from mutual friends. He offered to help me out, saying he had a few contacts that might be useful, including a friend who rented rooms at reasonable prices. It felt like a lifeline, and I immediately thanked him. With limited funds, I'd take any lead I could get. Meanwhile, I picked up extra shifts at my current jobs while waiting to hear back from the interview. Working all day and well into the night was draining, but I didn't have the luxury of cutting back. My days became a cycle of work, sleep on Chris's couch, and more work. Even though I was exhausted, I felt a strange sense of drive. Each hour I worked felt like a step toward independence. About a week later, my mom reached out. She asked if I was planning on coming back home for Jessica's birthday, talking like nothing had changed. There was no mention of the money, no hint of an apology, just the usual family expectations as if everything was perfectly normal. I couldn't believe they thought I'd show up, let alone celebrate like everything was fine. I told her I wouldn't be there, and she brushed it off, like it was my fault for causing drama. Ignoring my family felt strange but also freeing. I didn't need to answer to them anymore, and with that in mind, I doubled down on my own plans. I drew up a strict budget, keeping track of every dollar I earned and spent. It was bare bones, but I was determined to make it work. Cutting down expenses meant no luxuries, not that I'd had many before. My priorities were rent, food, and the bare essentials. Anything else was a luxury I couldn't afford. Finally, Zach came through with a solid lead for a place. A friend of his was looking for a roommate, and the rent was manageable with my current income. It was a small, old apartment, but it was better than living out of a suitcase on someone's couch. I met with my potential roommate, and we hit it off. He understood my situation and was cool with me moving in right away. I took the place without a second thought, happy to have a spot to myself. Moving in was a bit of a mess. I didn't have much, so I got creative, finding things from thrift stores and a few hand-me-downs from Chris and Zach. The room was tiny, just enough space for a bed, a small desk, and some shelves. But it was mine. After years of feeling like I didn't have control over anything, this little room was a victory. I took my time setting it up, putting personal touches on the walls, making it feel like a small haven away from everything else. Once I settled in, I decided to cut back contact with my family even more. Every conversation felt like salt in the wound, so I figured a clean break would help me focus on my own life. Slowly, I found myself relying on friends more. Chris and Zach felt more like family than my actual family ever did. I didn't have to worry about them judging me or taking advantage. For once, I felt supported without any strings attached. Every now and then, I'd feel a hint of guilt creeping in. Part of me wondered if I was being harsh, if I should give my parents a chance to explain. But then I'd remember what they did, how quickly they chose to take my savings without even asking, and the guilt would fade. They made their choice, and now I was making mine. I couldn't keep going back to people who only cared about me when it was convenient for them. With each passing day, my resolve grew stronger. I focused on the future, determined to leave the past behind and finally build something of my own. It wasn't easy, and there were still plenty of unknowns ahead. But for the first time, I felt like I had a real shot at happiness on my own terms. Update 2. A few weeks after settling into my new place, my mom messaged me out of the blue. Her message wasn't a simple "how are you?" or even an apology for the money they took. Instead, she asked me to come home because they were having financial issues. It was like a strange déjà vu, my parents reaching out, but only when they needed something. I read the message a few times, unsure how to respond. Coming home wasn't an option, especially not after everything they'd done. I sent a quick response, something polite but firm, saying I wasn't ready for contact yet. Healing takes time, and I wasn't about to rush back into the same mess. I put my phone down, thinking that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. Through mutual friends and people around town, I started hearing bits and pieces about Jessica's latest situation. Apparently, she had fallen back into her old habits. She'd been hanging out with a rough crowd again, spending money she didn't have, and getting into trouble. My parents were struggling to cover her expenses, and the financial burden was hitting them hard. Just as I was piecing things together, my dad called. I hadn't heard from him since the day I'd left. He went straight to the point, saying they needed me to help as a family. He mentioned that they were trying to get Jessica back on track and needed money for her recovery. It was all framed as some grand family duty, like I owed it to them to help clean up her mess. It was frustrating, almost surreal. They didn't care about what I'd gone through, the work I'd put into building my own life, or the damage they'd done. They just wanted me back because it was convenient for them. My dad kept talking about how Jessica was struggling and that family stands by each other. But where was this loyalty when I'd needed it? I vented to Chris about it later that night. He listened, then gave me a piece of advice that stuck. He said, "You don't owe them anything, man. They're only calling now because they're in trouble, not because they care about you." He was right, and I knew it. Every interaction with my family was draining, and getting pulled back into their chaos would undo all the progress I'd made. The next time my parents reached out, I told them straight up that I couldn't help financially. I was struggling too. Rent, bills, and groceries were a lot to handle on my current income. They didn't take it well. My mom shot back, accusing me of abandoning the family and being cold-hearted. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same person who drained my savings for my sister's fresh start without a second thought. My friends rallied around me during this time, reminding me that I didn't have to play their game. They reminded me I was building something good here, a life that wasn't weighed down by guilt or family drama. I'd been sucked into my family's toxic dynamics for too long, and stepping back felt like a relief. Still, my parents kept trying, sending messages with phrases like family loyalty and "you owe us for raising you." Each text felt more manipulative than the last. After a while, their messages started blending together. I began to feel indifferent. My parents' guilt trips didn't hit the same way anymore. Their words lost power as I realized I was happier now. For the first time, I could make choices without constantly worrying about disappointing them or living up to their impossible standards. Then my aunt called. She's usually on the sidelines, but this time she'd been pulled into the situation. She urged me to do the right thing and come back home to help out. She said family was all that mattered and that I needed to show more understanding. It was almost laughable, hearing this from someone who barely knew the full story. I was polite but clear, telling her my own health, mental and financial, came first. I wouldn't be going back, and I was done discussing it. With each call and message, I felt my resolve growing stronger. Setting these boundaries wasn't easy, but each time I stood my ground, I felt a bit more confident. They couldn't control me anymore, and I was finally finding peace in that. Update 3. After distancing myself from my parents, I stumbled upon a local support group. They met once a week, mainly for people dealing with toxic family dynamics. At first, I wasn't sure if it was something I'd benefit from, but something about being around people who understood made me want to give it a shot. During that first meeting, I sat and listened as people shared their stories. It was the first time I felt like I wasn't alone, and I finally had a space where I didn't need to defend my decision to step away from my family. One of the first people I connected with, there was an older man named Rick. He'd been through something similar and had spent years working on his own healing. Rick quickly became a mentor of sorts, sharing the wisdom he'd picked up along the way. He didn't tell me what to do, but he offered guidance on navigating life beyond a toxic family, reminding me that it was okay to prioritize my own happiness. Just having someone there who understood the struggle without judgment made a world of difference. As the weeks went on, the group became my main social circle. We'd grab coffee after meetings, share stories, and for the first time, I felt like I had a support network I could rely on. Through them, I also met others who had been through their own battles, people who'd lost family, left marriages, or cut off toxic relationships. Knowing we'd all taken difficult steps made it feel like we'd formed a kind of family of our own, a chosen family where everyone looked out for each other. One day, Chris invited me to spend Thanksgiving with him and a few of our mutual friends. Normally, holidays with my family were tense affairs, all about appearances, with everyone pretending things were perfect for a few hours. This invitation was different. There were no expectations, no pressure, just a group of people who wanted to celebrate together. I accepted, grateful for the chance to experience a holiday without the usual tension. Thanksgiving was simple but perfect. We didn't have a huge spread or fancy decorations, but there was an ease in the air, everyone bringing something to share, laughing and telling stories. At one point, Chris looked over and raised his glass, thanking everyone for being there. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. For the first time, I realized I could create my own traditions without needing my biological family around. I didn't need their approval to feel like I belonged somewhere. Around that time, I decided to try therapy, something Rick and the others in the group recommended. I'd been avoiding it for a while, convinced I could handle things on my own. But each session helped me unpack years of anger and sadness I'd been carrying. My therapist encouraged me to focus on building my own life, separate from the expectations I'd grown up with. It was tough, but with each session I felt lighter, as if I was finally shedding a weight I hadn't realized was there. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely happy. I started noticing the small things I'd always overlooked. I picked up a hobby, learning to play guitar, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the freedom or resources for at home. Every chord I learned felt like a victory, a small step toward reclaiming parts of myself I'd forgotten. The more time I spent with my friends in the group, the less guilty I felt about cutting off my parents. They'd been a constant weight on my shoulders, and being away from them helped me see just how much I'd been conditioned to put their needs first. Now, I was finally learning to put myself first, to do things that made me happy, without worrying about someone else's reaction. Over time, my friends became my family. They were there in ways my biological family had never been. We celebrated birthdays, supported each other through tough times, and even spent casual weekends together, where everyone was welcome, no conditions attached. There was something freeing about knowing I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. As I grew more comfortable in my new life, I decided to share my story online. I figured there were others out there, feeling trapped in similar situations, not sure if they could or should step away from their families. Writing everything out was cathartic, and the response was overwhelming. People reached out thanking me for sharing, saying it gave them the push they needed to take control of their lives. It felt surreal, knowing my experiences could help someone else. I started spending time on forums, giving advice to others dealing with toxic family situations. I didn't have all the answers, but sharing my journey and offering a listening ear felt meaningful. Each message or comment from someone saying I'd help them meant the world to me. I realized I could turn my past pain into something positive, a way to support others the same way my friends had supported me. Looking back, I never imagined I'd find peace outside my family, let alone feel this fulfilled. I'd always thought family was something you were born into, something you had to stick with no matter what. But now I know that family can be chosen. It's the people who stand by you, who lift you up, who celebrate your successes and catch you when you fall. I'd found my family, one I'd built on my own terms, and it was everything I needed. Update 4. Just when life was starting to feel stable, my parents found a way to throw me back into the chaos. I got a message out of the blue saying Jessica was in serious trouble and that they needed me. No details, just a vague, desperate-sounding plea for help. I stared at the message for a long time, reading it over and over, as if somehow it would make more sense on the 10th read. The timing was almost too perfect. I'd just started feeling comfortable in my new life, and suddenly they were back, pulling me in with guilt. Part of me felt a responsibility, that old reflex that told me family came first, but I also knew the cost of going back. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another trap to pull me back into their world, where I'd always end up paying the price. Still, the message weighed on me. It was hard to ignore the guilt they had embedded into me over the years. I turned to Rick, my mentor, who had helped me so much during the last few months. He listened patiently, nodding as I explained the situation. His advice was simple but firm. Remember why you left. You've made progress because you finally put yourself first. Hearing it out loud made it clear. But knowing something and acting on it were two different things. Then, my friends gathered around me and added their own support. Chris was especially blunt, telling me that my family's messages weren't just a request, they were guilt-laden traps, pulling me back to a life I'd worked so hard to escape. They encouraged me to cut off contact completely. You've done enough, Chris said. You deserve peace. Their words hit home. I needed to be free from this never-ending cycle. After a sleepless night, I made a decision. I blocked my parents' numbers. It felt like a drastic step, but I couldn't keep going back and forth, letting them upend my life every time they decided to reach out. It was painful, yes, but deep down I knew it was the right thing to do. In my next therapy session, I worked through all the tangled feelings of guilt, fear, and even anger. My therapist helped me understand how deeply rooted my need for family approval was. I realized that, for too long, I'd let my family dictate my sense of worth. But I was finally learning to let go of that. Cutting them off was about more than just blocking numbers. It was about trusting myself, knowing that I could stand on my own. But the stress didn't magically disappear. I struggled to focus at work, my thoughts drifting back to those messages, the worry gnawing at me. My boss noticed my distraction, and I could tell he wasn't thrilled. I didn't want my family issues to spill over into my work life, but it was hard to keep the two separate. Thankfully, my friends noticed I was struggling. They stepped in with reassurance, reminding me of the progress I'd made and encouraging me to keep going. To reinforce my decision, I wrote a letter to myself, a promise of sorts. I jotted down every reason I'd had for leaving and the goals I'd set for myself. It became my anchor whenever I felt myself slipping into old patterns of doubt. Reading it over gave me strength, a reminder that I was building a life on my own terms now. Then, things escalated. My family couldn't reach me directly, so they started using other people, extended family members I hadn't spoken to in years, to send messages. A cousin reached out, then an uncle, both saying the same things about family loyalty and how I was being selfish. The more they pushed, the more my resolve solidified. Each message was a reminder that I'd made the right decision to step away. At one point, I even considered taking legal action to stop the harassment. It seemed extreme, but they weren't backing down, and I knew I couldn't keep dealing with this forever. The stress was already taking its toll, but my focus was clear. I wasn't going back. Eventually, I found a way to tune them out. I ignored their attempts to guilt me through other people, focused on my job, and relied on my friends to keep me grounded. Each day that passed without giving in felt like a small victory. It was as if I was proving to myself that I could, in fact, live independently, without the weight of my family's expectations. In the end, I found a strange kind of peace. Blocking them, standing my ground, and focusing on my new life had given me a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. I knew the door was closed now. There would be no more surprise messages, no more pleas to come back and fix things that weren't my responsibility. I was done, and for the first time, I felt fully in control of my life. I'd come a long way since I'd first left home. I'd built a support network, made my own choices, and rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under years of family expectations. Now, I could focus on healing, on building the life I wanted, without looking back. Update 5. Life felt different now. The weight I'd carried for so long was finally gone, and with it, I found a new sense of freedom I hadn't thought possible. It was like my world had cracked open, and I was standing on solid ground for the first time. My hard work hadn't gone unnoticed at my job either. I'd just been offered a promotion, a full-time position with better pay and more stability. It was everything I'd been working toward, and the timing couldn't have been better. To celebrate, my friends surprised me with a small get-together. When I walked into the room and saw everyone gathered with balloons and a cake, I felt a warmth that I'd never experienced in my family home. Chris raised a glass, giving a toast about how proud he was of me for coming so far. It was a simple party, just a few of us laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying each other's company, but it felt like a milestone. I realized that, without even noticing it, I'd built a true family, one that was there for me through thick and thin, with no strings attached. As the night went on, I couldn't help but think back to everything I'd gone through to get here. The arguments, the betrayal, the guilt, they all seemed like a different lifetime now. I shared a post online, not to vent or seek validation, but to thank the people who had become my chosen family. I wrote about the journey, about how I'd learned that family isn't always the people you're born with, but the people who stand by you without expecting anything in return. The response was overwhelming, and reading through people's comments reminded me that I wasn't alone in my experience. Others were out there, going through similar situations, and I felt an urge to help in any way I could. As part of that commitment, I decided to step up as a support group leader. Rick was stepping back to focus on his family, and I wanted to give back to the community that had helped me so much. I started organizing weekly meetings, sharing my experiences, and helping others who were navigating their own family issues. Each meeting reminded me of where I'd started, and it felt good to offer others the same support that had pulled me through. Around this time, I met someone special. It was unexpected, but one of my friends introduced me to Diana at a casual hangout. We hit it off instantly, bonding over shared interests and a similar sense of humor. It was easy to talk to her, like I didn't have to explain or hide anything about myself. As we started seeing each other more, I realized I was finally free to explore a relationship without worrying about my family's opinions or expectations. I was finally building something based on my own choices. With this new stability, I started making plans for the future, my future. I'd never allowed myself to think that far ahead before, but now I started saving with real goals in mind. I wanted to travel to see places I'd only read about, and one day, maybe, buy a place of my own. The thought of having a place that was completely mine, without any memories of the past, gave me a sense of purpose and excitement. Therapy continued to be a huge part of my life. Each session was a step toward healing, a process of understanding that my family's issues weren't mine to fix. Through my therapist's guidance, I let go of a lot of resentment, not for their sake, but for my own peace of mind. Forgiveness, as I learned, didn't mean forgetting what they'd done. It meant choosing to move forward without carrying the burden of anger. It was freeing, letting that go and realizing I didn't need their approval to be whole. My mental health was improving by leaps and bounds. Small things that used to trigger memories or make me feel inadequate no longer had that power over me. I could enjoy moments with my friends without the cloud of family drama hovering in the background. Every day felt brighter, lighter, and I could finally appreciate the joy in everyday moments, the laughs, the support, the feeling of being valued. Reflecting on everything, I knew I had no regrets about the choices I'd made. Stepping away from my biological family wasn't easy, but it was the best decision for me. I'd learned that real family isn't about blood, it's about support, respect, and love. And I'd found all of that in abundance with my chosen family. I shared this message whenever I could, promoting the idea that family isn't a duty, it's a privilege. With my friends by my side and Diana in my life, I finally felt whole. I didn't need validation from anyone else. I was building a life filled with people who genuinely cared about me, and it was more than enough. I felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I was finally living on my terms. Each day brought new possibilities, and I was embracing them fully. Looking forward, I felt excited, not because of what I'd left behind, but because of what I'd built and what lay ahead. I'd created a life of stability, love, and true family, and I knew it was just the beginning. For the first time, my future looked bright, and I was ready to live it fully, with my chosen family by my side.